Welcome to the Nomad product keynote. I'm joined here with Armon, and in just a moment, Yishan's going to join us to talk more about what we have in store for Nomad later this year. But to start out, I want to talk about how Nomad has been on this journey for many years now towards a 1.0, and talk about what a 1.0 means for HashiCorp. I think a lot of our community expects us to release 1.0s much sooner than we generally do. I think the average time for us to get to a 1.0 for our products is around 4 years, maybe. Well, Nomad was released in 2015, and so I think it's very on topic to talk about what 1.0 looks like for Nomad today. To do that, I want to first talk about what is important in a 1.0 for us at HashiCorp generally across any of our products. We look for a number of different things when we talk about a 1.0. I think one of the first things we really look for is enough adoption and stability in that adoption. So people are really using it for a variety of use cases. Those use cases are stable, and they're use cases that we do want to support for the product. Another thing we look for is architectural stability as well. So is the core design of the product itself in a shape that we could support for years and years to come with limited breaking changes and feel comfortable doing that. In addition to that, the user experience of our products is super important. That's something we've always taken to heart from a 0.1 for all our products. And so even if the product's super stable and it's used for a variety of use cases, if we feel we could really, smooth out some rough edges and make things more enjoyable to use, we like to do that ahead of time so that when we release a 1.0 and many users come and join the community, that they have a really good experience out of the box. And a lot of these things we look for in a 1.0, they're hard to define, they're hard to measure. And so a lot of people say, you've reached them years ago, or we're not quite there yet. As a team, we just ask ourselves with every release, are we ready to be 1.0 yet? And what does it look like to be 1.0? And we're getting there with Nomad, and Yishan's going to talk more about that. Armon, do you have anything to add about 1.0s?
No, I think that largely covers it. I mean, I think the other piece that's sometimes hard for us to articulate is, often we might have a sort of an idea of like what are all the use cases for the product, but those use cases might not yet be sort of like well defined or sort of polished in the product itself. And so I think what's tough is if you're only using the product for kind of that happy path and the use cases that we sort of do well support, you might say, yeah, this already feels like a 1.0 product. Like, what's HashiCorp waiting for? Versus sometimes there's these other use cases where we say, you know what? When we first imagined this product, we thought about, use cases A, B, and C as being kind of core to it. Yeah, we've really nailed A and B. Those are already at a 1.0 stage, but C is not quite there. Let's really kind of flesh that out before we consider the product, truly a 1.0. So I think sometimes that's a little bit tough from the community aspect because you're using the tool, you feel like I've been using it in production. It does, task A really, really well. But we have this bigger vision for a lot of our products, and that's why it just takes them many years to get there.
Yeah, and we've talked about this before where even though a product is at 1.0 doesn't mean that it's not being used heavily in production or that we support it for production. Nomad is a great example of a product that we've sold to enterprises, sold support contracts alongside of it, sold enterprise features alongside of it for production use cases for many years, and yet it's not 1.0 yet, it's production ready. So I think a 1.0 for us is really, we view it as a commitment to our community that we've reached a very important milestone that we're committed to with a product.
Well, and I think that point you made is also a really good one, which is I think part of that commitment is that we won't have breaking changes, immediately after that around those core use cases. So I think that's the other really key aspect is like, if we anticipate the need to introduce breaking changes, let's do that before we ship it and call it a 1.0, so that when we get there, there's this stronger promise of sort of forward compatibility. So I think that's a really good point is around that notion of what's the commitment we're making.
Yep, and I think a lot of it is around staging the product for changes we want to make after 1.0 in a way where we don't need to make breaking changes to get there. So I think a good example with Nomad is actually introducing the auto-scaling capability that we had in the past couple releases. We weren't quite sure ahead of that auto-scaling capability if it would require changes to Nomad that were breaking. And so we just wanted to make sure to get the auto-scaler in before 1.0, even though we didn't expect sort of the auto-scaling functionality, for example, to reach 1.0 quality alongside Nomad.
Yeah, I think that's a great example of the type of use case where we always imagine auto-scaling would be a part of the original sort of vision for the 1.0 product. You might say you didn't need the autoscaler and that we could have gone, 1.0 with earlier release, but I think that's a great example of like a piece that we always imagined as being part of a 1.0 deliverable.
So as a company, we publish a lot of principles. We have something called the Tao, and we have something called the HashiCorp principles that both define how we build our products as well as how we interact with each other in our community. I think it's worth talking about, if you would, Armon, how we look at these principles in the Tao and how they impact our product development with Nomad in particular.
Yeah, I mean, I think we talk a lot about both these documents, and I really think that they do guide a lot of the design and the behavior at HashiCorp. So when we talk about the Tao of HashiCorp, it's really the sort of core design ethos, right? How do we think about the problem itself, right? So whether it's kind of this notion of workflow over technology, meaning really what Nomad cares about is that workflow of when you say, defining a job file, the CLI interaction, the UI interaction, all of that workflow is kind of the same, whether you're deploying a Docker container to the cloud or whether you're deploying a VM image on premise, right? So that technology, the underlying piece of it, is sort of pluggable, but the workflow on top is really what we focus on as the consistent layer. So there's a bunch of other elements within the Tao. The Tao really focuses on our design ethos, which is kind of common across all of the tools. I think the principles is sort of a different one, which is also interesting. The principles of HashiCorp are really meant to drive less of technical design decisions and more of sort of the human decision making. How do we sort of act as people, and how do our sort of processes reflect that internally? And so I think when we talk about, how do the HashiCorp principles apply to a 1.0 or apply to sort of a product like Nomad, I think there's a few different pieces of it. Not all of them apply, but certainly some of them do, right? I think one big piece of it is vision, right? So when we talk about vision as part of the principles of HashiCorp, the idea is if we don't have sort of a destination in mind, if we don't have a kind of a clear picture of here's where we're going as a group, then it's really hard to rally around, right? Especially if you talk about a large group, including our customers, our community, our internal developers, et cetera. How do we rally everyone around a common vision of where the product is going, right? So I think part of that is just the destination setting. And I think, having that vision of, hey, when we get to a 1.0, this includes A, B, and C, let's say, as core use cases. So that's kind of piece one. I think a second piece of it is pragmatism, right? How to be super practical. Great, when we started Nomad 5 years ago, right? Really, I think I should say we released it 5 years ago. We started it 6 years ago. You have to be pragmatic and say, great, you have this grand vision for what the product should be when it gets to a 1.0. Practically speaking, it's going to take you years and years of development to achieve that. So where can we start to add value right away? Where can we be pragmatic about evolving and growing the product over time to kind of get to that 1.0, but realizing that it takes kind of the fullness of time to really get there, right? And this has been true with all of our products. And then I think what this ties back into kind of is, to Mitchell's point, is HashiCorp tends to be sort of unconventional in terms of how long it takes us to get to a 1.0, right? I think we sort of pride ourselves on it means something. I think we see a lot of, folks in the ecosystem that treat a 1.0 as, the software compiles, call it 1.0. Versus for us, I think this speaks to our principle of integrity, right? Does it show and demonstrate intellectual integrity if we call a product a 1.0, if we don't feel like it's robust, if we don't feel like the architecture is stable, if we don't think, there aren't future breaking changes? So I think integrity is also kind of a really key part of it, of, an intellectual integrity and honesty of, no, this thing just isn't a 1.0 yet. Here's the bar, here's how we're going to get there pragmatically. And I think then the last piece of it is reflection, right? And I think reflection is a huge part of our principles, which is how do we actively challenge ourselves? And to Mitchell's point, with every release, right, we ask ourselves, is this 1.0 ready? If not, what else do we need to do to actually incrementally get there, right? But we have to actively reflect and ask ourselves, are we ready? Are we ready? Are we ready? If not, what should we do differently? Where do we need to focus and harden it? So I think those are a few of the different principles that I think kind of come to play when we talk about, how do you apply the principles, which is really a human-oriented concept to sort of a product development process.
Yeah, and I think this comes up a lot in, the principles are a result of sort of the human element of software development, so to speak. And that human element sort of comes through in a few ways. I mean, I think one is that we like to make software that has a more tightly defined surface area. And what it does, it doesn't try to do everything all at once. And so Nomad was very focused on being a cluster scheduler. Another human element is that we know people are going to use this thing. And so we want to make it, as easy to operate as possible, fun to use, things like that. And you could see the results of that in some of the case studies we published where one of our customers talked about a junior engineer, junior developer upgrading the entire production Nomad cluster. I mean, that's the core system that runs all their applications, and a junior person was able to do that. And that I loved that because that fits perfectly with our design ethos and those human elements. And I think the last one with the pragmatism is just understanding that people have problems to solve, and you are usually going from a place you previously were towards getting to that solution. And so I think one thing we recognized back in 2015 when we started this project was, containers are obviously the future, but there's a huge number of workloads that are both non-containerized and also non-Linux. And that same case study I just previously mentioned is a very large Windows user, and Nomad was huge to them because it works on Windows. And so I think these are all a reflection of those principles that we believe in around, pragmatism, vision, workflows, things like that, in order to build a product that is sort of, at this point, I guess, like quintessential HashiCorp.
Yeah, and I think, one of the points you raised, which I really like, is when we talk about pragmatism, I think it sometimes gets interpreted as, really only focusing on a few narrow things that are sort of like, this is the practical, thing that the market cares about, right? I think often we get asked, like, why does Nomad, for example, support things other than containers? And I think what you make a great job of pointing out is some of our largest users run non-containerized workloads on Windows, where I think those sort of, the market would tell you that, containers on Linux are the only workload that matter, right? And at the same time, I think people would tell you, well, practically, does anyone need to run more than, a few thousand containers? I think people sort of made a whole point out of it when we did this 1,000,000 container challenge, where we ran 1,000,000 containers on top of Nomad, and people were like, well, but is that practical? Does anyone actually need that? And the reality is, yes, we have, paying customers that run workloads many times larger than that. So I think for us, pragmatism, goes beyond just sort of like what's the common knowledge of sort of the industry and kind of what's hot, to really listening to users, really listening to customers, understanding what they're doing, and really focusing on that as pragmatically, that's their problem, that's their reality, right? So I love that point you made, Mitchell. I do want to introduce at this point Yishan Lin, who is the product manager for Nomad, to talk to us a little bit more about what does a 1.0 mean in the context of Nomad.